Yeah, I know those cycles don't last very long. That was just more. That's interesting. It's also interesting to me how in depth they would have to go because there's so many links in that chain. It's amazing to me that you're saying they're very quick about it, and because the first thing I hear is government, and the second thing I hear is that is a lot of parts that they have to touch to figure this out. So that's impressive.
Welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brendan Black, and today's episode is a very exciting one. This is our first ever interview with a non-agricultural individual. Yeah, this is our first average consumer conversation that we've had on the podcast, and I gotta say, it was really fun. Patrick and I met in an online community, and we got some great conversations going about agriculture and about the podcast and about what I was trying to do, and he was really interested in the project. He has a very minor background in agriculture, I guess, with being from Louisiana, but it was really interesting to hear his curiosity and interest in the subject, and all of the questions they came up with were actually really, really good questions. So it is a bit of a longer interview, so I'm not going to take up much more time. I just wanted to give this little intro, but it's really fun, and thanks again, Patrick, for tuning in, and make sure you stay till the end, but I'm just going to let you guys know there is going to be a part 2 to this interview just because of how much we wanted to talk about and how little time we had. So in a couple weeks, that's going to be coming out, so look forward to that as well, and thank you and enjoy. So I'm here today with Patrick. I've been talking to Patrick quite a bit over online on the Reddit communities I've been involved in lately that I've talked about in previous episodes. And Patrick is going to actually help me talk about today some consumer issues, questions, comments, concerns that are facing the ag industry that farmers and other individuals involved in this industry aren't quite as aware of. And we'll get more on that later. But first of all, I'd like Patrick to kind of give himself a little introduction and talk about anything he wants to mention before we get into this conversation. So, Patrick?
Hey, Brendan, thank you so much for reaching out to me on the Reddit and giving me a chance to hop on and talk about things. I've been looking forward to this quite a lot. So a little bit about me. I guess I grew up in Southeast Louisiana, so I am aware, at least tangentially, of especially dairy industry. So I didn't work in it, but I grew up around it, and everybody in the area did, so I was aware of that. So yeah, this will be fun. It'll be kind of fun to rehash some of those roots. And also, I co-host a podcast with my friend Becky. We do the SillyMundaneThings podcast. We talk about all kinds of things, and kind of on a little bit of a hiatus right now with all the events happening right now. It's just been quite a lot. We actually have some stuff recorded that we haven't released yet, so we're just kind of sitting on that for a minute. And then so I've been looking to guest on some shows, and Brendan was so kind to invite me on, so I'm really excited to be here and say hello.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on, and I'm very glad to have this conversation with you today. I've said on multiple occasions in episodes that I've been looking for someone from a non-agricultural community or with less of an agricultural background to talk to, because it seems to be part of the disconnect that I've seen, at least between consumers and producers, is just that we don't have enough conversations. Consumers assume a lot about farmers, and farmers assume a lot about consumers, and there's not a whole lot of middle ground being discussed. And that's where I come in. I try to mitigate some of that lack of conversation. So that's what we're doing here today. So you kind of answered my first question there, just to kind of establish a basic understanding of where we're at in terms of your agricultural literacy, as we refer to it here on the show. I was going to ask you what your knowledge or background of agriculture is, and you basically discussed that. You're more exposed to the dairy side of agriculture, and you said Southeast Louisiana, right?
Correct. Yes. I had some friends who did some dairy, and they did some gracious, the term escapes me, but they did some of the meat cows. Gracious, what's the word? Oh, goodness, beef. Well, yeah, no beef. But there's a term. What's the term of the cow? You have milk cows, and you have what's the
veal calves?
I don't remember. No, it wasn't veal cows, but it was, I don't, anyway, meat cow.
Well, we'll get into that later, and that kind of starts to establish the foundation. You're off to a great start here, Patrick. It's okay.
The moo cow. It goes
the moo cow. The correct. But no, I wanted to establish some very, very basic questions that I've often faced some complications within the ag industry. And when I say complications, I just mean that I've discussed these questions with individuals that have had less than ideal answers to them. And so I wanted to see what your responses were to some of them. Just from what I can tell from our conversation before this episode, most of them I'm pretty sure I can assume that you know the answer to, but I just wanted to establish. And for all of our listeners, this is by no means to deem Patrick as unknowledgeable in agriculture. This isn't to appear condescending or to kind of, show off as like, hey, I know more than this guy about agriculture. This is just to kind of establish a strong basis of like, where intellectually can I communicate this information without it being over his head and without being condescending to him at the same time. So this is kind of just the background, or like the foundational questions I'm going to be asking every consumer that we have on this show from here on out, just to kind of give everyone a good idea of what we're dealing with here. So you already talked about what knowledge of agriculture you have. Cows go moo, obviously. Yes. And then my second question was, where does your food come from? And the reason I asked this question is because we have a lot of people who have very different opinions on how food gets from wherever it originates to their plate. And I'm assuming you having already answered this question, can answer it fairly accurately. So just real quick, where do you think your food comes from?
It comes from Walmart, right? So that is a broad question. I assume it does, it comes from farmers. It comes from agriculture because, you have farmers who specialize in growing, and you have farmers who specialize in meat and cows and pigs and etc., right? So
exactly. So okay. And that's the bare bones answer I was looking for, was just that it comes from agriculture. It comes from cultivation, from farming. Any of those answers would have been acceptable. You don't have to go into the full depth of, it goes from, a seed to a crop to, it gets picked and then it goes through the processing. And like, you don't have to go through all that. Just all I need to know is that you understand that it comes from agriculture. And one of the biggest things I like to point out to my guests to kind of throw them for a loop is that there's a statistic that gets thrown around quite a bit in the ag education, ag literacy communities that is quite old now. It's from 2011. I usually don't cite those as accurate statistics anymore, but there hasn't been a newer study to really relate that to that statistic anymore, so I still use it. But basically, a survey conducted by the Farmers and Ranchers Alliance said that about 72%-ish of Americans know next to nothing about agriculture. They don't know where the food comes from. They think it just shows up in a grocery store, something along those lines.
Okay, then. Well, no, so Walmart would actually be a lot of people's answer then.
Right, and that's why I asked the question, not because I don't assume that you know that food comes from agriculture, but because there's quite a bit of people that accurately, or not accurately, but legitimately believe that it just shows up in a grocery store. They pull it out of the back rooms, and it's just there forever. And so it's somewhat alarming, but that's why I need to ask it, because I need to know that you have that understanding.
I guess statistically speaking, if you have 4 guests on here, 3 of them are going to say Walmart.
if we just take them from random communities, you have a fairly high statistic of 2 to 3 of them thinking it's from Walmart. Yes, that's gracious. That's kind of the now you know our problem.
Yeah. Okay. As a business person, awareness is everything. It's like, if you're not aware, that's already big, like screaming red letters.
That's red flag number 1.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So that's the reason we started this podcast. We see that as a big issue. We're trying to kind of fix that. Gracious. So my second question for you, could you explain, and you don't have to go into the full process, but could you explain where chocolate milk comes from?
I can't say to the chocolate side of things, but milk comes from the cow, that's a good question actually, because the milk comes from the cow, but I don't know how they mix that because you get chocolate milk from, you can buy it from the same dairy or whatever that you get regular milk from. So I don't know the finer points of that.
So
that's a really good question. Yeah, I like that.
The fact that you didn't say that it comes from brown cows is the most ideal
Oh,
situation
okay.
here.
I'm just overthinking this. I'm like, I don't know how that works.
and that's why I have to ask these questions, because I don't want you to overthink it and think that I'm trying to trick you or anything. But just to give you another scary statistic, about 48% of Americans don't know where chocolate milk comes from, and you'd probably fall into that category. They don't know that it just is it's in its most basic form. It's just regular milk they pull from cows and they mix it with chocolate, which they get from cocoa beans, and there's a whole process to that I'm not going to explain.
Yeah, I was just thinking more like the factory process, like because it often does come from the same dairy, for lack of a better word. Like down home is Kleinpeter, so you get Kleinpeter regular milk and you get Kleinpeter chocolate milk, so they mix it themselves at wherever it's all processed. But
no, we have milk providers here, like Rosa Brothers, for example. I'm not sure if you guys have Rosa Brothers all the way out there, but it's a local dairy product provider that they have chocolate milk, they have banana milk, strawberry milk, they have all these different flavors.
Oh, nice.
And it always cracks me up because whenever they say, well, chocolate milk comes from brown cows, well, where's the pink cows for the strawberry milk? Where's the yellow cows for the banana milk? Like there's a little bit of a missing link here. But another statistic for you, about 7% of Americans think that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. They legitimately believe, and they're adults, by the way.
Oh my.
And
I don't have words.
Right. So you're starting to see our issue here. So I do have a couple more just ground baseline questions, and they're more just because I'm having fun with this and I like to scare you with statistics.
That's fine. I love numbers, so this is great.
So the next one, could you explain the source of hamburgers, or more like hamburger meat?
Well, the clown, he escaped from the circus, and he they come from cows, from the non-dairy cow, the meat cow that we talked about earlier, the beef cow, and I don't know what parts of the cow, but they process that into ground beef, and it is turned into hamburger patties. And you grill said hamburger patties and make them delicious, because the hamburgers are wonderful.
Precisely, and that's exactly what I was looking for. It's just they come from. I would have, even if you would have said they come from dairy cows, I would have accepted that, because as we can get into a little bit later, dairy cows are actually also used for beef purposes. There's an industry entirely dedicated just to beef, and then the dairy cows, if they get to the end of their life cycle, if they're not productive anymore, if they're starting to have issues moving around, or if they just get too old, then they get sent to the beef plant. Just that way they don't have to live in pain all the time. They kind of just get put out of their misery and they turned into burgers.
That makes sense. I mean, it's less wasteful, and that's also from a economic standpoint, if you're feeding a cow that's not producing, it's also not good. So that makes sense all around.
Exactly. And so that way, and like I said, we can get more into that later, but basically the reason I have to ask that statistic is because about 20% of adults don't know that it comes from beef. They think that it's either from pigs or that it doesn't come from animals at all.
Well, I have a question for you, which we can circle back to later. But do you focus on? Well, we can circle back to it, or you can cut this or whatever. But edit anyway. But do you focus more on the planting side of things? I couldn't the
like crop science style.
Yes.
Kinda?
Yeah. Are you more on the crop side, or are you more on the animal side, on the livestock?
So, in terms of, are you saying with the content I produce on this podcast, or me personally as an individual?
I guess, what is your primary? It sounds like you have quite a broad spectrum of knowledge, but what is your specialty? Do you specialize in the livestock or in the agriculture?
So I more accurately would say that I am more specialized in the animal agriculture style. That I think I know more aspects of animal agriculture than I do about crop science. But because I've been doing this podcast, and because I want to become an agriculture teacher, I've kind of prioritized learning a lot more about crop science. So I have a good range of knowledge in all areas.
Okay, perfect.
But a lot of my statistics are animal agriculture based, because that is where I'm most comfortable. So I'm assuming that's where you got that.
Yeah, well, my thought process was, it's like, okay, if he focuses more, so I was going to give you a trick question. It's like, how do you feel about like Impossible Burgers and that kind of stuff? Because they're still plant-based, but it's like, if he focuses on the animal side, he's probably not very happy about that. But if he focuses on the plants, he's like, yeah, I love it. This is great. We're going to keep me very busy. But,
well, the Impossible Burger is that's a whole thing. I mean, I can go in on that for hours. As an animal agriculture fan, I'm not a fan of it.
Mm-hmm.
as a supporter of agriculture as an industry, the fact that it's being produced at all just is supporting agriculture, which I'm fine with. I think that the politics behind it is a little silly, but that's a topic for another day. I think that the Impossible Burger is a very incredible development in science. I'll say that at least, because it is kind of incredible that they were able to create a burger that so closely resembles actual beef. I've never actually tried one myself, so I can't say anything in regards to its taste, but I've been told that they taste very similar. I've also been told they taste nothing like it. So I can't speak on that behalf, but the part of me that is more inclined to side with the animal agriculture side of things is less reliant or less dependable on trusting the plant-based foods. I'll say that much.
That makes sense, and I wasn't trying to incite, by the way. I was
No,
perfect. It's like I wonder where he falls on that, because it seems to be a net positive for agriculture, as far as, because we're gonna if we were to go away completely from meat, then we're gonna need a whole lot more plants. That's just all there is to it. So it seems to be a net positive for agriculture in general. But similarly, I have not tried it. I can't speak to it. It's just more of an interesting thing, like you say, from a science standpoint. Is like wow, they made vegetables taste like meat. That's like that's like as a very picky eater, I'm like, that, how do you do this? Because I need to get more vegetables in me. I love my steak and my pork and hamburgers and stuff. Spinach and broccoli, not so much. So if you can trick my brain to make that think like it's a hamburger, I'm cool with that.
No, I definitely see where you can come from that perspective. I'm a picky eater as well, so I definitely get that. I think that, like I said, the science behind it is very impressive. I'll say that much in the least. And we can get into this a little bit more as time goes on as well, but the science aspects of agriculture are just as important, if not more, than the farming aspects nowadays. Like, science and technological advancement is a massive part, and that's why a lot of people in the agricultural industry no longer consider themselves just farmers or ranchers. They consider themselves agriculturalists, because it's a much broader spectrum. Agriculture can mean you're a scientist, you're a researcher, you're a businessman, there's a lot of different hats that are under the agricultural spectrum, rather than just farming and ranching. And
for sure.
Yeah, so I think that the science behind the Impossible Burger is definitely very impressive, and I won't deny that at all. I just think that I don't think that personally it's possible for us to fully get away from meat, because like you said, we can't produce enough crops with as little land and resources as we have to equate the amount of food we have to produce to feed our population. But if it were to come to it and we were to go entirely plant-based, the fact that we have that technology available is somewhat reassuring.
Indeed. Oh, I just hit my mic. Oh, gracious. Yeah, I just saw the waveform spike. I'm like, oh no.
So my final question to you, before we get into the actual more in-depth conversations like we just had, this one's a little bit more, I guess I would consider it a little bit higher on the difficulty scale. If you were to ask the average person this, they would probably not fully understand what you're asking, or they wouldn't get it right. True or false? Cows must give birth in order to produce milk.
I would say true initially, but as long as you continue to milk, they will continue to produce milk. I would think that, yeah, I'm going to say true initially.
Okay, so that's an accurate statement, and I assume, being raised around the dairy industry, you've kind of learned that over time. But yeah, with any mammal, their biology does not play favorites. With any mammal, it's not possible for a female to produce milk, and only females can produce milk, by the way. That's why cows are female and bulls are male. But it's not possible for a female to produce milk without having conceived an offspring. And you're also right in the fact that it's not just, they have the baby, they get milked once, they're done forever. They get milked for a long period over time, but they do have to be rebred in order to restock that milk production, because they don't just milk forever after having that calf.
Oh, okay. I wasn't aware of that, actually. I excuse me. I was under the impression that as long as you continue to milk, their body would continue to produce. So I did not realize that they had to have another cow in order later on. How long does that period last?
Until they need to be rebred?
Correct, yes.
So they have what's called estrus cycles, and estrus cycles are basically the cycles through which you can plan out at what point they'll be ready to be bred back, basically. At what point they're reproductively accepting. And by planning out these estrus cycles, you can kind of dictate at what point your cow is ready to be rebred again. So there's no surefire way of saying, oh yeah, it's exactly 6 months before they do it again. It kind of just depends on the cow and the operation and how much they're trying to produce at a certain given capacity. So basically, it's usually a couple, it could be a couple months afterwards. It just kind of depends on the cow and how strong she is. If she's an older cow, if she's a new heifer, it depends. And so if you like for example, most cows produce, I could be a little bit inaccurate in this because the numbers change over time, but if I'm not mistaken, cows produce roughly 3 to 4 calves for an average cow. Healthier cows can produce 5 to 6 calves in their lifetime. Weaker cows can only produce maybe 1 to 2. It just depends. But in their average lifespan, they produce 3 to 4 calves, and they produce calves every 9 months. And so after 9 months, they wait a month or two of that cow being milked and kind of nursed back to health, and then they breed her again, so that way she could be pregnant and producing that entire time.
Okay, so you're talking roughly a year of milking before they go for another baby, roughly.
Yeah, just about. So
okay,
at
that's
all
shorter
times,
than I would have assumed. Honestly, that's interesting. And also, so that leads me to the question of, so you're sharing milk with the baby because you have the calf to contend with as well. So how much milk is typical for a cow on a given day? I guess since you're because after a period of time, you're going to be what's what I'm looking for? After a period of time, you're going to be getting just milk after the calf is no longer feeding from the mom. So, how much of an increase are you looking at after the baby is weaned?
So the logistics are a little bit unclear because there's a lot of factors that are taken into place. There's different breeds, obviously. So with you have Holsteins that are black and white, and those cows can produce more milk than most other breeds. They're actually Holsteins and Jerseys are the two most primarily used breeds because of that reason. Holsteins produce the most milk per cow, and Jerseys produce milk that's a lot higher in butterfat, which is used for different purposes. But Holsteins on average can produce, excuse me, like I said, it depends on your operation, but they can produce quite a bit of milk per day. Like I think the average per Holstein is like 7.5 gallons a day or something like that. I could be completely wrong on that, but it all depends on your nutrition, on your feeding operation, on your size of your operation. Like there's a lot of factors that go into that, but they produce a substantial amount of milk. And as far as feeding the calf goes, there's a whole system for that as well. And without going too far into the animal rights argument, to say the least, calves are actually separated from their mothers temporarily, or sometimes for long periods of time, initially after birth, for a few reasons. First of all, it keeps the calf safe in case the mother or another cow in the pen accidentally steps on it or harms it in any way. It gives the mother time to recover and try to get back on her feet. And it gives the calf some time to kind of be independent and learn how to survive without its mother around, which is really good for its health. And so in that process, that cow or any other, what we call fresh cows, which are cows that have just given birth, are immediately milked because that milk that they initially produce is called colostrum. It's a milk that is only present for a short period of time, and I can't remember the exact period of time. That might be 24 hours, it might be a few days, I can't remember exactly. But that colostrum is extremely high in antibodies, it's high in nutrition and different nutrients that the calf needs to grow. And so they collect all of this colostrum and separate it because some cows are going to produce more than others, and they give all that colostrum back to the calves immediately. That way the calves can still grow strong, and if that calf gets paired with a mom that just doesn't produce enough milk for that calf still gets the supplement that she needs.
Very interesting. I'm actually quite aware of the colostrum side of things from my wife, because I have kids, and so yeah. So I'm like, oh yeah, I know all these terms. Yeah, this is great.
That's one of the things I always forget, because humans produce colostrum too. So
correct,
people,
yes.
Whenever I talk to people about colostrum, they're like, oh yeah, my wife just had a baby, so she produces that, and it's like, oh yeah, people do that too.
All the mammals.
Correct. I guess I should take a note for my own book. But so yeah, that's kind of the, just going into the dairy side of things. That's the basic description of the milk producing process. So before we move on, do you have any other questions about that particular industry?
No, that was interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So that was it for my foundational questions. I've kind of got a pretty good gauge of how, how knowledgeable you are in this subject and how, where your curiosity is kind of at. So I can kind of base my questions off of that. Just, a few foundational in the sense of awareness questions. Have you heard much about agriculture or the food system or anything like that on social media? Have you seen posts about it? Have you seen people talking about farming or agriculture in any kind of sense? And if so, what have you heard about it?
So here's where I feel like my breakdown of knowledge is. I am tangentially aware of how the farming system works, just growing up in a small town with a lot of dairy farmers and that kind of stuff. But what I know nothing about basically is once it leaves the farm, I know there's a whole in between process between farm and Walmart so it's like there's a whole in between process, and like milk has to be pasteurized and so is that done by the farmer? Does the farmer, so whenever, let's keep with the cow example, when cow is milked, they take the raw milk and take it somewhere. Is that usually handled by the farmer as well, or does he take it to somebody else to handle that? How does distribution work from there? Because I'm very interested in that.
So the supply chain is actually a very integral part to agriculture, and it's one that's often overlooked by most consumers. They like you said, they don't really know that whole middle step process, and it's actually one of the most important parts of the food we eat, because that's how we know it's safe. That's how we know it's dependable. That's how we can not get sick from raw materials. So to answer your question, the farmer does not handle once the product is produced. That's it. The farmer sends it off, and he doesn't touch it again. And so
okay, so he sells it to that at that point, and it's not his baby anymore. So correct. In my example, Klein Peter, they don't make the milk; they buy the milk from the farmers, and then they do all the processes, pasteurizing, and send it to Walmart to be sold.
Right. So that's they're considered a middleman step to the operation, and there are some larger scale dairy operations. I'm choosing dairy as an example. This is true for all industries. They just have different levels of steps to the process. So like the beef industry, the poultry industry, eggs, wool, they're all going to have different steps to the same result in that we get the product at the end. But the number of steps and how those steps are handled is going to be a slight difference in each industry. But just for dairy, for example, there's some dairy operations that I know of that actually handled their own production of milk. They handled the pasteurization, they handled the packaging, and then they handled the marketing all in one go. And those are very few and far in between. Most dairy farmers, they produce the milk gets picked up by a truck and gets sent off to the next step, and they're part of either an LLC, which if you're familiar with business, which you said you are, I'm sure you understand what all that stuff is incorporated with. So they're usually part of an LLC, or they're part of a larger corporation, or they're part of some, collection of other farmers in a community that they all have their milk go to one location, and that's where it gets pasteurized, sterilized and processed and packaged. And, that's where it starts to go down the chain of how it gets to the point where we can buy it in gallons and jugs at the supermarket.
So this gives me a question. So whenever you have an issue, let's say you have whatever, some kind of something happens in a breakdown, and you get a breakout of some kind. You see lettuce recalls happen on occasion, that kind of stuff. So is that why all the the milk in California or whatever will have to be recalled, because so many farmers bring everything to that middleman and to be processed, and then they can't tell where it came from? They just know that this one processing plant took everything, and so we don't know where it came from. We just know that it came here, and then it got spread out to these these areas. Is that how they are able to narrow that down? If there's an affected issue with a crop or meat or whatever?
Yeah. So food safety is a very it's always been a big concern in agriculture, and it's rapidly becoming an even bigger concern, because over time we've seen consumers become more and more interested in where their food comes from, and slightly more concerned about some of these issues, because like you said, they see recalls happening of lettuce and of tomatoes, and some meats are now not safe, and so they don't know what to trust. And so we see a lot of that kind of stuff happening, and there's a very long and drawn out process in how that all is handled. There's a lot of first of all, like, I'll just very briefly go over all the steps that are not all of them, but the very basic steps to go into recalling it in terms of food safety. But basically, you have the CDC, or like the whatever, like CDC is, at least in the United States. I'm not sure how it is in other countries, if they use similar processes or not, but at least in the United States, CDC is used to do hazard analysis. So they go to the site where the outbreak first occurred, and the outbreak is defined by a few different things. It depends on certain factors, but if it affects a certain number of people and it's a certain product, then it's considered an outbreak. But if it affects like one person, one time, in one instance, it's not considered an outbreak. So there's certain criteria that have to check the box before they consider it a big issue and worth contacting farmers about. But basically, it goes backwards through the chain. So the CDC goes and analyzes. They send all their information to the FDA, the USDA, all these other government organizations that are responsible for that food distribution process. And a lot of them have to do with, because the government is actually partially responsible for the safety inspection and quality control that goes into the production agriculture side of things. So like there's government officials that actually come to farms and inspect everything and say, this isn't clean, this isn't up to regulation, this needs to be higher, this needs to be lower, like all this kind of stuff to make sure that they're following guidelines, to make sure that all of their quality control criteria is checked off, all their safety analysis is clear, and that they're free to produce the food. So
is that the Department of Agriculture that does that?
The United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, is one of the departments that is responsible for that. The FDA also has a role in it, but they have a slightly different role. It depends on which industry you're talking about. I believe for dairy it is the USDA, but like for poultry and eggs, I think the FDA takes it over. They all kind of split up their responsibility in different ways.
Interesting. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to derail. I was like, oh yeah, I wonder.
No worries. But yeah, the USDA they send a representative down there. They have them inspect everything, tell them it's good. So when an outbreak happens, the CDC gets all their information. They send it off to the FDA and the USDA, and they analyze it and say, okay, at what point along the chain did we see this stop working? Like, at what point did we have the least inspection? At what point did we pay the least attention? And they go all the way backwards up the chain. They go to the transportation and check all the trucks to make sure the trucks were clean. They go through the manufacturers of the packaging and make sure all of the machines are clean, all the packaging is clean, all the employees are wearing gloves, all the everything. And then like they back up through the pasteurization process and make sure that the pasteurization machines are all clean and up to code. And then they go all the way back to the farmers, and they check every single farmer and all of their operations to see if they could find the source of it. Sometimes they do, and there are cases where it doesn't fully get found, but for the most part, they have very in-depth control criteria that help from preventing these kinds of things from happening on a larger scale than they already do. So when an outbreak occurs, they pretty much have it handled very, very quickly. That you hear the scare about it for a few weeks afterwards, but it's pretty much gone by the time it even hits the news. So,
yeah, I know those cycles don't last very long. That was just more. That's interesting. That it's also interesting to me how in depth they would have to go, because there's so many links in that chain. Mm-hmm. It's amazing to me that you're saying they're very quick about it, and because the first thing I hear is government, and the second thing I hear is that is a lot of parts that they have to touch to figure this out. So that's impressive.
Oh yeah, they have a very, very elaborate system for analyzing all of that stuff and making sure that all their ducks are in a row, and making sure that anyone who was even remotely close to touching that food is very carefully inspected, and everything is checked and everything's good. It's a very nice and tidy system, and that's part of the reason why the United States is kind of adorned the crown of having the safest food supply in the world.
Well, that's USA, I guess. America, etc. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So, and that's like, I can go on a whole speech for food safety, and I have before, but that we have a lot of regulations in place regarding food safety, and there's a lot of other countries that don't have that same level of detail when it comes to analyzing and inspecting and doing all that kind of stuff. So that's why whenever we have foodborne illness outbreaks, it's usually because we imported that food and it wasn't as deeply inspected as it would have been if it was grown here.
That is really cool. That's yeah, I don't have much to add. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think the food safety process is definitely a very interesting process to analyze, and I've been trying to find a good graphic for it. I can't seem to find one, but there's usually good graphics that show the full chain of what happens whenever a foodborne illness outbreak happens. But if you're wondering about the chain of agriculture, there's a graphic that we use a lot. Basically, it goes from production to processing to distribution. Sorry, I was reading something. And then it goes to the restaurant / retailer / home preparation, and then the consumer gets it from there. And so like that's your very basic chain of how the industry goes. So like let's take the dairy industry for example. So production, milk is produced from the cow. Processing, that's pasteurization, that's cleaning, that's all kinds of stuff. Distribution is where it gets put into bottles and packaged, and then it goes to restaurants, retailers, home preparation, all that kind of stuff. So that's since you were asking about the in between steps between us and the farmer, that's your basic rundown.
So when you're talking home prep, are you talking HelloFresh type? And if this is sponsored by HelloFresh, man, I tell you. but no, is this is that, how do they get access to this? Because they basically get to jump ahead in line ahead of Walmart. So how do they get access?
When it comes to stuff like that, like pre-prepared meals and all that kind of stuff, I'm not fully aware of the process through which. I'm sure they have some kind of connection to a distributor, and like any retailer has connections to a distributor, so they get their food very conveniently from, like, the distributor brings a truck over. That's why you always see trucks at like Target and Walmart that just unpack all kinds of food and they have it there at the store. I'm sure HelloFresh and other pre-planning meal stuff like that have some kind of connection to a distributor, or maybe they even have a direct connection to a processor or even the farmer in some cases. It just depends. Like there's some providers of food that I know of, especially if they're more like on the organic side, or if they have certain labels on them, they skip a lot of the steps. They go straight from producer to processor to retailer, like almost immediately. It just depends on what kind of connections and what chains need to be crossed to get to that level.
That's fair. And also out of your area of expertise, so it may not have been a fair question, but I was like,
no, that's fair.
Yeah, okay. Right,
yeah,
cool.
that's definitely something that I haven't been asked before, so I'll have to do more research on it. But it's worth looking into, because the food supply chain is very important to understand.
Indeed.
So
thanks for hearing me.
Yeah, my pleasure. The next question I have, do you know, or do you have a general idea of what big issues the ag industry is facing right now? Just let's say nationally.
My understanding is that it is incredibly hard to make money unless you're gigantic. There, the days of small dairy farms, because like I said, I grew up in a lot of area of dairy farms. What I didn't say was, though, the number of dairy farms had gone from several to just one or two. There's not, the local dairy farm guy, just, they don't make money. They just can't make enough money to stay open, so you have to be huge or you don't survive. That seems to be the biggest issue, at least in small town America, that I can see. Yeah,
no, it's definitely, I would say if we were to rank the issues, like that's easily top 3, like biggest issues. Just staying alive is a huge issue right now, just because of a bunch of different factors. I'd say that staying alive is probably the byproduct issue of a few different combined issues. So in no particular order, I think that some of the biggest issues we're facing are urbanization. So obviously the farmers have a lot less land to work with. Regulation is a big one, especially here in California. Farmers are not allowed to do a lot of the things that they need to do. California in particular, water is a massive issue. I know that's not an issue in a lot of other states, but water is huge here. And I think, at least personally, there's a bunch of other issues I could go over, but I think personally, public perception is definitely one that we're struggling with too. And not that...
What is that?
Public perception? Basically how people view agriculture.
Oh, okay. I'm like, I don't know what this is.
Yeah, so and that's, okay. Yeah, if there's anything I explained that you don't understand, just feel free to ask about it. Like, I know I kind of get into a habit of talking about things that people don't understand, so... No,
you're good. I just never heard that term before, but that makes sense.
So basically what I mean by that, and I'll go over all those issues independently, but the public perception issue, the thing that I think is dangerous about it is that not just that people don't fully understand where their food comes from. Like I mentioned earlier, almost 3/4 of the population thinks their food just shows up in a grocery store. That part is concerning in and of itself, but that's not really damaging to the ag industry. What is damaging to the ag industry is the fact that those same people are voting on regulations that are hurting farmers. And those same people are making marketing choices that are ultimately affecting farmers at the end of the day. And, it's less of those people are actively opposing agriculture. It's that the fact that they're unaware of it is causing them to make choices in their day-to-day lives that are impacting farmers that they're not even aware of. And so I think that, I'm not to say that, everything that they vote on is a bad thing. or every regulation they pass is a bad regulation, or that the choices they make when they buy are bad choices, but they're inadvertently affecting farmers in ways that are potentially dangerous, and that if they knew more about their decisions, that it might be more beneficial to the farmers in the long run.
So you need a good marketing guy.
Exactly. And that's the big issue that we face right now in the ag industry. That's part of the reason why I do this podcast. On top of everything else, it doesn't help that a lot of our main audience base, our main consumers, don't really know much about what we're doing. And because of that, they vote on things that are ultimately hurting the ag industry, or, like I said, they're buying products that are causing negative ramifications or negative perceptions of the ag industry. And labels are the biggest contender to that issue.
Well, how do you combat that? Because there's not, a lot of farmers do come together, but a lot of even the big farmers, they're still, just a guy or just a family who hire a bunch of help and that kind of stuff. So how do you organize? And, and they're also very, very, very busy. So how do you organize them to get the word out? What do you do about that?
So that is the golden question right now, is what do we do about this? I think that, first of all, I'm doing it right now. Just having conversations like these, just bringing awareness to some of these issues is the most important aspect of trying to fix this issue. I think that a lot of people are seeing this as a, this is never going to be fixed kind of thing. We're just in a new generation and people don't care about agriculture. I'm a little bit more optimistic than that. I think that it can be fixed. It's not going to be perfect. You're never going to have a full population that's back to knowing a farmer. Because, if you went back even 20 years ago, a lot more people were very, comfortable with agriculture. They knew a farmer. They were very connected to the industry. We live in an age now where most families are 2 to 3 generations disconnected from agriculture at some degree. Most urban families have never even seen a cow or never even been on a farm, never even met a farmer before. And yet they vote on things that are affecting these people's lives and ability to feed their families. And I think that it's definitely not an easy fight. It's definitely not, and I don't like to think of it like a fight. That's a common misconception, is that people in the ag industry are often talking about how we're not against, but it's almost like we're in the boxing match against consumers. And that's not at all the case. Consumers are perfectly comfortable, as I've learned now after meeting you and some other people through the online communities. Consumers are perfectly comfortable having these discussions. It's just that nobody's having them. And one of the biggest issues I've seen is like the one you mentioned. Farmers are too busy to deal with this kind of stuff. I understand why they're concerned with the losing their land and the regulations and the lack of water and maybe the overabundance of water in some states, or the weather is destroying them, or the markets are crashing because of everything going on in our crazy world right now. There's a lot of factors that are keeping farmers distracted from this issue, and I understand that, and I perfectly agree that they should be focusing all of their attention on those matters, because that's what they can control. And most farmers, the average age of the American farmer is 58 years old.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, farmers are getting older and older. They're not going down in age. A couple years ago, it was 56. They're just growing in age. They're not really... The new generation of agriculturalists is not wide and broad enough to replace what is needed to be replaced in order to save this industry. And that's kind of terrifying to me, as someone who has a bright perspective on what this industry could accomplish and how important this industry is. It's scary to see that we're not replacing it fast enough, and that we're not going to be able to save it if we're going at the rate that we're going. And
so something like that, you're gonna have supply issues if you're not replacing the workers. So how are you gonna? Wouldn't that pull people in? Because if the prices start to go up, then that would attract more business-minded people. It's like, wait a second, there's money to be had over there. It's like we need food, and we don't have enough food, and it's costing expensive. So I'm going to get out there and start, chasing cows or whatever the farmers do these days.
I've very rapidly learned that people don't put one and one together and say this orange costs more money than it used to, therefore farmers must be struggling. People don't think about that kind of stuff because, like I said, a lot of them don't even realize that orange comes from a farmer. They think it just shows up there. And
in seasonal stuff, it starts to get complicated too, because oh wait, this is because we eat a lot of fruit, but blueberries are, when you get a blueberry different times of year, it's like, oh yeah, I can tell that this came from Mexico because it's smaller or whatever, and it's way more expensive because it's out of season or whatever the case may be. But most people are just not aware of that. It's like, why are the blueberries $10 now. I don't understand. It's like,
Right. Yeah, and that's, there's fluctuations in the market, and like you said, the seasons change, and there's different times where certain economies do really well because other economies are blooming, and there's certain economies that crash because other economies are crashing. And it's hard to convey that idea to consumers, especially consumers that aren't aware of why that's happening. And so the issue that we're facing right now in the ag industry, on top of all the issues that are, I consider, more physical, I consider this issue of consumers not being aware of what's going on a somewhat less physical issue, in the sense that it's not something that farmers can really do much about right now. It's not the forefront of their minds. It's not something that they prioritize. It's kind of just up in the air, and it's just kind of there. But I feel, and maybe I'm just, a naive kid about this, but I feel like if more attention was brought to this issue in particular, it might save a lot of other issues. Because if people were more aware of what farmers are going through and more sympathetic to that industry that's feeding them, they might be more they might be more conscious in their decisions as they go on, whether it be voting or selecting certain products in the store, or helping out just by like being more active in helping out farming communities. I'm not saying they have to donate to farmers, because by no means the farmers are going to accept it. That's just how they are. But having an appreciation for the people who put in countless hours to help out with that industry is undeniably valuable. And I'm part of a community on Facebook right now that's called My Job Depends on Ag. And I've talked about them quite a bit. I've actually had the creators on the show a couple times. And the entire purpose of that show, they're all farmers. They're all hardworking, farming community guys. And they get done, harvesting their crops for the day. They hop on Facebook and they just talk about this stuff. But the choir that they're preaching to is all farmers. They're not having conversations with non-agricultural people, but they're talking about how important it is that non-agricultural people appreciate the amount of work that's being put into creating their food. And I always kind of laughed at that. It's like, well, why aren't you telling that to them? You want them to appreciate you, but they don't even know you exist. Why don't you reach out to them and say, hey, how about you come see my farm? How about I show you what I'm doing and I explain it to you? That way you can kind of get a better appreciation of how much work goes into putting what's on your table right now. So I think there's a lot of issues with the communication problem right now, and none of them are on the fault of consumers being actively opposed to farmers. There are some, but I think more of them are on the fault of we just have a really bad method of communication right now. And I'm trying to fix that. I'm trying to be the mitigator between that conversation.
Well, it's one of those things that there's a lot of issues going on right now, and I'm not going to get any kind of political or anything going on, but it's like there's so much stuff going on right now, and lack of awareness in so many different areas that I think if people realize what's going on in any particular area, they would start to realize, oh wait, there's a whole lot here, a lot more here than I realized. Because people get stuck in their bubbles because everything is so segmented and so I'm in lending, so that's all I care about. That's all I'm worried about. I go to Walmart and I buy my ground beef, and that's all that matters. But there's a whole life of where that ground beef came from, and to say nothing of the other produce or whatever. So being a more well-rounded human and learning about those things, I think, is good for everyone to be able to just understand where these things came from.
Yeah, and by no means do I expect people to go out of their way and, go help out farmers or go, lend a hand and do their part in the community. Like, that's not what I'm asking. All I'm asking is that people are more aware of their decisions, that, before they vote on something, they really pay attention to what they're voting on. And that goes true for all things they vote on, not just agricultural-based legislation.
For sure.
And
I walk a mile in the person's shoes. Just know what
exactly.
you're looking at.
Exactly.
And I think we could, again, with the current things going on right now, I will get a little political and just be like, and just say with the things going on right now, we could all stand to walk in our brothers and neighbors' shoes and realize what's going on. So in all areas of life,
I completely agree, and I think that there's a lot of issues facing. I'll go back to agriculture for this, just because I don't, I'm trying not to get too off topic here. But
I was meaning it was political, but agricultural. Well, there's a nice mirroring of topics there.
No, absolutely. I don't mean to say that you were, stepping out of your boundaries there. But
no, fair.
No, but just in terms of agriculture, I'll get off my soapbox here in just a minute. But basically, all I think that is the message here is that I want consumers to be more aware of the process that goes into producing their food. And I think that having those conversations is really important. I think that farmers need to be more attentive to alerting consumers about these processes. And I don't blame the farmers for being too busy for that. That's why I'm taking up the responsibility of that task. And there are other groups that are actually focusing on that same thing. National Ag in the Classroom, Ag Ventures, My Job Depends on Ag, the Farm Bureau, like all these organizations are active in trying to communicate these messages to consumers. They're just, in my opinion, reaching in the wrong direction. They're heading towards other agricultural communities and teaching little kids about agriculture, which is great. I think that teaching kids at a young age that where their food comes from is fantastic. But if we're not having these conversations with the people who are actively making consumer-based choices, then we're making a big mistake on our part. And that's why I'm trying to mitigate this. I'm trying to have conversations with people like you who are, you're the average consumer, I would say. You're fairly well educated in agriculture. You may not know all the ins and outs, but you know enough to have a decent conversation about it, and that's what we're looking for. What we're scared of is the people who think that everything we do is evil and that farmers are plotting to take over the world and that, we're trying to poison all of you with pesticides and stuff, and I don't understand where that came from. I don't understand why people believe that farmers are that way, because I don't think people realize that farmers eat their own food, but that's a whole other conversation. But basically, to end my soapbox speech, I just think that it is a big issue that people on both ends of that conversation are not reaching each other perfectly well, and I'm trying to help with that issue.
I think you have got a good little bullhorn there to help with that. I think that's a good thing, because it's a good resource to somebody maybe like me who has a tangential awareness of what's going on, but if somebody asks, hey, you grew up in a small town, what do or whatever, it's like, being able to point them to, hey, if you want to learn about some of this stuff, go check this out, because that little word of mouth can help, hopefully spread some things around a little bit that gets it outside of the circle a little, especially if it's interesting, and it's not just all about, it's not all about the boring things associated with farmers, and I hope you don't think of it sad. I don't intend it. But there's some things that's like, I'll give you an example. We talked about Smarter Every Day off mic earlier, and one of the videos Destin did was on grain mills, and never in my life did I think a 20-minute video on a grain mill would be interesting, but my goodness, that was a brilliantly executed, very interesting video about how a grain mill is built, but also what it does, and he kind of delved into the farming side of things, and you were talking about how farmers are business guys and chemists and all this, trying to figure out pH and all this. I mean, they're brilliant folks, and there's so much that goes into getting soybeans from their grain mill to the destination. I don't remember if it was soybeans, but it was something like that. Peas. I don't remember the crop, but it was really, really cool and really interesting. And to somebody like me who doesn't have a whole lot of knowledge on that, I was like, no, this is great. This is the kind of stuff that the community needs. It helps people understand, and also helps you give respect for what farmers deal with, because they deal with a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that having videos like that is amazing. Having, a firsthand experience like that of actually showing people what goes into a lot of these different processes is really, really beneficial for helping people understand that better. And like you said, it's things that you would never imagine are really all that interesting, and you see them, you're like, whoa. Like, I was talking to a guy the other day about how they use robots in agriculture now, about how they use drones, about how they use artificial intelligence in a lot of different ways, and that blew his mind. He was like, what do you mean they use robots in agriculture? And I explained it to him, and he was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. And
I wasn't aware of this. That's super cool.
And I initially meant for this episode to go in that direction of let's talk about weird parts of agriculture you don't know about. I went a little preachy. I apologize for that. I wasn't trying to get... That was
interesting. That's great.
I wasn't trying to get all up in you need to support agriculture today kind of thing. I meant this for more to be like a conversation of what don't you know about agriculture that you want to know about? Are you curious about GMOs, pesticides, robots, technology? What can I broaden your horizons on?
And I would have said, whoa, back it up a little bit. Did you say robots?
No, and I know this episode's going a little long. I don't want to take you away from anything you got else planned tonight. I don't know if you've got other things you want to work on, but I don't mean to take you away from your evening. I'm sure you have other responsibilities.
I do have a couple things going on, but I don't want to. I don't have to break away like right now. But if we're gonna get into robots, that may be worthwhile of spending some time on. At least another time. I don't know, because robots sound super cool.
Well, I was going to say, since we've kind of covered the general, like the basics of agriculture in this episode, we've covered a general idea of what what your average consumer would be curious about, or what they would think. I think that's a good place to establish on this episode. We've covered a couple things in depth. I think what I would want to do is have another episode, since my episodes usually don't tend to go quite this long. Have another episode where we just, you write out as many questions you could think of. I'll write out as many topics as I can think of that I think that you probably don't know much about, and we can just have a day where we just discuss that kind of stuff on an episode. We'll talk about robots. We'll talk about GMOs and pesticides. We'll talk about artificial insemination. All the questions that you could potentially ask about agriculture, I'll try to answer.
That sounds like a blast. I would love that.
Because that's, like I said, that's initially where I was planning on going with this episode, and it just kind of got a little out of hand.
That is podcasting with me in general. So thanks for your patience on that. My co-host, if she gives this listen, she will laugh. So
no, I definitely appreciate you coming on the show. I definitely appreciate you putting up with my mini rant there. I kind of get a little... It's been a long time since I've done an episode. I took my own hiatus. Like you mentioned earlier, you're on a hiatus right now from your podcast. I am very... this is the first episode I've recorded since going off of on my own hiatus. So I got a little passionate, a little excited, a little, oh, this person hasn't heard my speech yet. Let's give him my speech. I
appreciate you feeling comfortable to give it. No, that was great. And I appreciate you having me on to talk about this in general. It was really cool to go back to my roots and discuss some of these things and delve into stuff that I didn't know about. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you being my first interview for what I'm considering the season 2 of this podcast. I'm actually planning on having 2 episodes before this, kind of discussing what's going to be addressed in season 2. And season 2 is all about these kinds of conversations, having more serious conversations with consumers about what's going on in the ag industry, what needs to be discussed, what is being missed in that conversation, and then having some goofy conversations of like, did you know that we're using drones to look at cows? Like, just like weird stuff. And so I think that this is a good first episode for that that demonstration of like, this is what we're going to be doing for the rest of the season. And I look forward to having another episode where you come on and we talk about goofy, fun facts that you didn't know about agriculture.
I look forward to it.
Well, like I said, thank you so much, Patrick, for being on this episode. I really appreciate your time. Like I said, I don't want to pull you away from your responsibilities because I know that you're a busy guy. But I just very much appreciate, especially having someone who's not, like you said, you're well versed in what you know about agriculture, but you're not by any means an expert in the field. So I appreciate you having the confidence to come on here and trust that I wasn't going to just put you in your place. So
fair enough. I appreciate you not doing that. I didn't walk away feeling stupid. I just walked away feeling, oh, there's a lot I could learn. So that was good.
And that's all I was hoping for. I was just hoping for a conversation where we both walked away with, oh, there's more to this conversation than I initially anticipated.
Good. Well, that's good.
So, like I said, I appreciate your contribution. I look forward to having another episode with you. If you have any questions that I can answer right now that aren't going to take an hour long to get through, I'd be happy to answer them. If not, I can, happily start writing out a list of topics that we could talk about for the next episode. If you want to write out any questions that you have just based off of what we talked about today, or anything that you see in between now and the next episode, I'll be happy to answer them then.
Okay.
Other than that, I think that's all I have. So if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, you can address them now.
No, I don't think so. I think we had a good springboard. I think we covered it all, but there's still a lot of robots, so a good springboard for next time.
Yeah, definitely. We left on a bit of a cliffhanger. So
teaser.
That's right. Tune in for the next episode. We're gonna be talking about robots. So.
Yeah.
So there you have it. That was our first ever interview with your average consumer, with a non-agricultural person. I gotta say, it went really well. I had a lot of fun talking to Patrick. He had some great questions, and it was a really interesting conversation. And it kind of opened up my eyes a little bit about the consumers that I've been talking about so much on this podcast, that they have a lot more interest in the industry than I ever imagined. I really look forward to having this segment more on the show and talking to more consumers. And I already have a couple episodes planned out that I hope you guys are looking forward to. I'm definitely gonna have Patrick back on. Him and I have already been talking about doing a second part to this episode, so you can look out for that probably in a couple weeks. And I definitely have some other consumers that I've already been talking to that are very interested in being on the show. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you guys are really excited about this as much as I am. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope you tune in next week to see the next consumer interview. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.